Okay, good morning, everyone. This is our third session on the history of opera. And today we're going to do an amazing theme, an amazing task. We're going to talk about Giuseppe Fortunino Francesco Verdi. Giuseppe Fortunino Francesco Verdi. So that's his full name. And of course, talking about opera, this is the greatest of them all. Still the most performed composer, and La Traviata, which we're going to cover today, is one of the most performed operas in the world. So congratulations, we got to Giuseppe Verdi, who was born in October of 1813 in a small village, a nearby place called Bassetto. And there are so many amazing facts about Verdi. So the first one is actually Italy wasn't in place back then because, as you know, the neighbors of the country always wanted a piece of it. And Italy was divided between cities/states and different parts were separate. So Italy was completely separated into smaller states. And the neighbors, France, Spain, Austria, they always wanted a piece of that beautiful land. So technically and legally, Giuseppe Verdi was born in France because Bassetto belonged to French government. Later on, he claimed that he was born into a family of peasants, illiterate, simple people. But he wasn't completely honest. Yes, he was born into a middle class family. And unlike Puccini or Rossini or a lot of other musicians, he wasn't born into a musical family. They had nothing to do with music because his father was an innkeeper, something we now call bed and breakfast. So he was a host of a bed and breakfast nearby Bassetto. Or now we even call it Airbnb when we make a reservation on the internet. So his father was an innkeeper. But when Verdi was about 5 years old, they noticed his talent in music. So they bought him some musical instruments. They hired good mentors and teachers. And he started performing at the local church. So the thing about Verdi, he was a great entrepreneur. He was a wonderful businessman. And it started very early, by the age of 8, when he was a small boy, 8 years old. He got paid as an organist at the church. He was the solo organ player in charge of the entire music of each mass. So it tells you something about his talent as a manager and a businessman. One of his mentors in early life was the local, another businessman, wholesale businessman, as I would say now, Rossini. And when Verdi applied to be accepted to Milano Conservatory, he was rejected. So to help him, Rossini hired him as a teacher for his young daughter, Margherita. And the young couple fell in love and they got married. So we'll talk about this marriage a little later. Verdi also had a younger sister who unfortunately died at the age of 17. She was his closest friend, but he lost her at very early age. So he ended up being a single son, no siblings, and his parents did everything to help him in his musical career, even though, as I mentioned, they were not musical at all, and they were not in the musical Bohemian society, not a part of it. But he made connections pretty fast, and he did pretty well financially his entire life. He was wealthy, he had his glory, he had his fame, and he left a great legacy. He wrote 25 operas, and La Traviata was one of his most famous ones, even though it failed in the beginning, so we'll get back to it. So back to his career and marriage. The marriage didn't bring any happiness, even though they were madly in love, because in 1837 and 1838, he lost two children. They were barely 1 year old. They barely reached their first birthdays. They both died from illnesses. And then in 1838, his wife, Margarita, died from encephalitis, which was, you can imagine, in 3 years, 3 deaths. And he was, of course, frustrated. So even though he wasn't admitted to the Milan Conservatory, they did a contract with him for 3 years to write operas for them to be staged in La Scala. So they didn't mind buying his operas, but they didn't accept him to be a student. They thought he wasn't well prepared for this level of training. But we can see the greatest composer didn't even need it. So while all those terrible things were happening, he was working on his first opera, Oberto. And of course, it failed because he was devastated and couldn't really complete his work. He always worked a lot on editions, and he was unable to. But in a couple of years, Nabucco, or Nabucodonosor, came out in 1842, and that was a great success. Before that, Verdi wanted to quit as a composer. He wanted to stop writing because of Alberto's unsuccessful performance, only one performance. But then Nabucco became the greatest hit, and one of the areas of Nabucco, Va Pensiero, which is the chorus of Hebrew slaves, it became an unofficial hymn of Italy, and has been always performed for great holidays. So what happens after several performances, he meets his future wife, a great soprano, Giuseppina Strepini. Giuseppina Strepini, and they fall in love, and that was a big scandal because he was only 38 when he met her, but she had a pretty bad reputation. So he was, in a way, La Traviata because she had a lot of illegal children, not legitimate. She had a lot of love affairs, but then she met Verdi and he became the love of her life. But when he brought her back to his native community, people rejected her completely. So they were living together for 11 years until they got married. So interesting facts about Verdi. Let me mention some of them. The first thing, his date of birth is not clear still, because on October 11th, 1813, the church clerk wrote down born yesterday, but we don't know how he calculated at midnight, the dawn, the sun set, sunrise. We don't know that. Okay, Margie. Okay, Margie is here. Hello. So it's still not clear. So he always celebrated his birthday on October 9th together with his mother. Another interesting fact, as I mentioned, he was a strong negotiator and managed to make a fortune on his operas. He adored Shakespeare, and he wrote a lot of operas based on Shakespeare's plays. Falstaff, Macbeth, Othello. One of his late masterpieces was Othello, again based on Shakespeare's play. As I mentioned, he wasn't accepted to Milan Conservatory, but his name will forever go down in the annals of Italian history. Not only because of his music, but because he was a great patriot. While Italians were struggling to unify the country, Verdi became their voice, the official voice of unification. Okay, so sorry. Okay, I'll get back to it. And his Nabucco hymn became the unofficial hymn. He could be difficult, as his contemporaries mentioned. People who knew him personally, they mentioned he was very demanding and sometimes difficult. For example, he had an argument with the director of La Scala and promised to never work with La Scala, and he didn't. For 40 years, up until his latest Othello in 1887, he refused to work with La Scala, but his operas were performed everywhere in Europe. And the interesting thing is he never had an agent, so he traveled all over Europe. I couldn't find out whether he went to Egypt when he was writing Aida, but he definitely went to Russia, to St. Petersburg, to make sure, so his purpose was he wanted to make sure all his performances of all his operas went flawlessly. He was taking care of the orchestra. He was doing casting. He was deciding who is going to sing the main parts. So traveling a lot, he was meeting a lot of people and making a lot of connections. And that's how he met Josephina, because he wanted to be there when everything was prepared for staging. So he was his own greatest agent and manager. There were periods when he wasn't writing. Him and Josephina, they went to his, I would say, property in Bassetto, and he was madly in love with the earth. He was growing things, he was managing his farms, his land. He became a grand landowner. So, you know, great people are great in everything. What else is interesting? He had a strong competition, rivalry story with Richard Wagner. Wagner died a long time before Verdi. Verdi died in 1901. He crossed the border of the 20th century, but Wagner was gone already. They never met, but they watched each other's work pretty closely. And Verdi's latest work was definitely influenced by Wagner. They had different styles. Verdi was following the traditions of Donizetti, Bellini, and Rossini, of course, creating his own unbelievable music. But latest period was marked with the influence of Wagner, even though nobody would call them friends. His death was mourned by the entire nation. To his funeral, 200,000 people came. 200,000 attendees came to Verdi's funeral. And Toscanini from La Scala performed his wonderful Va Pensiero from Nabucco at his funeral as a requiem for Verdi. The Patriots even created an acronym. Verdi meant we bring unification and liberty to this country in Italian. So they just spelled VERDI for this acronym. And they everywhere they put billboards, as we say now, Viva Verdi, meaning liberty and unity to this country. So those are interesting things about his character, his personality, and his incredible life, full of fame and tragedies. So, La Traviata. It means a fallen woman. It's a beautiful word. It sounds good to our ears, but it means a fallen woman. Okay. Wow. They might cut us down. I don't want this to happen. So in 1848, Alexander Dumas, the son, wrote a novel, The Lady with Camellias, or The Lady of Camellias in English. And in 1952, it became a play, a very popular play in French theater. While Verdi was traveling with Triponi, they saw the play in France, in Paris. And upon arrival back home, he started working on this opera right away. And the first performance happened a year. The first performance of La Traviata, the opera, happened a year later in Venice Theater. And it wasn't successful because he wasn't happy with the cast. But after the first performance, which was kind of a failure, Traviata became the most performed opera in the world. Back to Alexander Dumas. The story is autobiographical because he lost the love of his life when she was only 23, and she died of tuberculosis, as we call it now, TB. And so does Violetta in La Traviata, and so does Dumas' heroine in his play. And I was always curious, why the Lady of Camellias? Why not roses or peonies? I don't know, something else. And guess what? There is a reason for that. Because his lover, Dumas' young woman who he loved, because of TB, she was allergic to strong odors. So she couldn't stand any flowers, but she loved flowers. And camellias are known for not having ascend. So she surrounded herself with comedians. And that's the reason why we got The Lady of Camellias and later on Traviata. So it's an opera of 3 acts, and the second act has 2 scenes. And the performance you're going to watch, I hope you all got the link, it's not a staged performance, it's a movie. And I wanted you to see it because it's a masterpiece by itself. It was made in Rome, in Italy, in 1967. Great actors, great voices, and just a wonderful performance. And each act has a brief review of what's going to happen, which makes watching even more pleasurable. And also it has English subtitles, so I hope you will enjoy it. So the first act begins with Violetta throwing out a party. She's throwing a party because she feels better. She knows she has TB. She knows she's dying. She just doesn't know when, and she enjoys life and love as it is because she's a famous, rich, wealthy courtesan. So her lover, her supporter, her sponsor, Baron Roberto, he brings over the young Alfredo. And we all, of course, know this aria by Alfredo. Let's drink from the joyful cups. So at the end of the first act, Violetta took ill again. She is not feeling well, and all guests leave, but Alfredo remains there. And he tells her that he's been in love with her for a long time, over a year, always admired her, and will always be there for her. And he wants her to quit her profession and just to be with him, and because his love is going to be all she needs. He will always take care of her no matter what, and they should be together. So the first act ends with another very famous aria. Violetta sings Sempre Libera, always free. She can decide whether she should give up her profession and just stay with Alfredo and just love one man, the only man in her life.